All right, thank you. Looks like is it recording yet?
Yes.
All right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Advanced Product Quality Planning and Production Part Approval Process webinar. My name is Russell Palmeter. I work for Pratt & Whitney. I've actually been with Pratt & Whitney for about 23 years next month. I've just recently joined the quality organization as one of the fellows for PPAP and process certification here. So it's my privilege to introduce the strategy group team here and kind of set the pace and the groundwork for today's session. If you want to go to the next slide, please, we'll go through some quick ground rules. So just as everybody probably heard, we are recording today's webinar, and the session will be available for your download and for consumption after the event, so you can share it with your colleagues and your team members. There will be a question and answer session at the end of today's webinar. So we'll take questions during the webinar using the chat feature. There is also, I think, an option to enter questions in the Slido drop down if you have that available. But the questions, we'll go through those in the chat as well. We do ask that everybody please remain on mute during the presentation just to decrease the background noise. And then, we'll also be muting lines during the start of the session as well. Okay, next chart. So the agenda for today's webinar, we'll be going through essentially the components of the APQP and PPAP from the procedural level to when and where does APQP and PPAP apply, some of the details of the PPAP file and submission, what's required as elements for each of the PPAP tools, and then talk about some interaction. How does APQP and PPAP interact with each other, and how do we manage this going forward? And then we'll close with the questions and answers. Next chart. So Magnus and Oke are going to be the hosts for the Q&A session. They'll be keeping an eye on the chat function as we go through the webinar, and then at the end they will take us through the questions that are presented. I think last but not least, Becky, you have the survey questions in Slido. There'll be a link, a QR code on the next slide that you can use if you can't access the Slido dropdown to the right-hand side of the participants window. Then there'll be a QR code that you can load onto your mobile device, and then Becky will activate each of these questions one after the other in order to get the feedback from the team, and this helps us understand kind of what your exposure is to APQP and PPAP, and how we can tailor these webinars in the future. Becky, did you want to add anything?
Yes, so we do have the first Slido live polling question open. There may be a button on your screen, a green button that says Slido. If you can't see it, you can click that button to open the live polling. If you don't have that, just take your cell phone and scan the QR code and then enter that little passcode there, the passcode 5FBEZF. It's like an eye chart. If you scan that QR code and enter the passcode, you'll be able to answer the Slido live polling questions on your cell phone. So it looks like we already have 36 votes that have come in. The first question is, have you read AS13100? 71% of respondents said yes, and 29% said no, and we're up to 38 votes right now. So go ahead and keep voting on that. There's 42 votes, and then once we have the answers to this question, we'll continue on with other questions, and we'll save a couple of questions towards the end of the presentation today, and we'll launch those later. So just watch your screen or watch your phone for additional questions to be launched. And we're at 48 votes, so back to you.
All right, thank you. I think the first presenter is up right now, so I'll pass the baton over to Ken to take us through the AS 13100 sections.
Thank you, Russ. Hello, everyone. Ken Hatcher, work for Raytheon Technologies. And for those who are unaware, Raytheon Technologies, it was a company that merged about a couple of years ago from Raytheon and United Technologies, where we have such businesses as Pratt & Whitney, Collins Aerospace, Raytheon Missiles Defense, and Raytheon Intelligence and Services. Been within quality for a little over 20 years. Worked everywhere from to the shop floor all the way up to managing more of a program level, and worked from hardware, software, and also supplier quality along the way. Next slide, please, Carl. So in this section, we're gonna kind of look to see, hey, where is that, how do we kind of harmonize the efforts between, AS 13100 and such other standards as 900, 9100, 9145. And where do those differences exist? This is going to be a high level. I might give a couple examples, but we're not going to really, go over line by line what the differences are between the two, but we're going to figure out how, 13100 kind of came about. Where can you go for your reference information to help you with implementation, and kind of some of the advantages of this type of structure that can have for you in helping implement within your business itself. Next slide. So when you talk about the foundations themselves, the aerospace engine supplier supply quality, the AESQ, we're trying to find a way to harmonize and bring together the different standards and requirements that were out there. I kind of equate this to when I first started out, good Lord, about 10, 15 years ago, helping implement NADCAP within special processes and some type of and destructive and non-destructive testing, where is trying to help come up with one set of rules, one set of one kind of standard to go work towards, instead of having to worry about all the different either mil spec standards or company standards that were out there. Well, this standard is kind of trying to do the same thing. I know it's pulling aerospace, QMS standards from 9100, looking at the 9145 standard, customer requirements, even international, and kind of bring those together in kind of a one location where you can go within 13,100 and get those requirements and those supplemental requirements to ensure that you can have a good QMS and also have a good APQP PPAP process and program. And it's just that harmonization that comes into place that helps us, that can help a business out, a supplier, or a particular program out with implementing within our particular kind of work set here. Next slide, please. And kind of when you kind of look at a real high level, the comparison between the two, 9145 is there to really cover aviation, space, and defense, kind of, three different type of business areas. Meanwhile, the 13,100 is just focused on the AESQ members there. Just looking at this particular, hey, the people who produce, who work in this particular environment that come up with a standard just to help you. There's not only the AS 13100 standard, there's also the Chapter B, which is in the back, and also the reference manuals, which are really helpful in terms of, hey, here are the standard, here are the particular requirements, the deliverables that need to be out there. It helps that appendix, that Chapter B, helps give you that delta between 9145 and 13,100. It kind of helps, give some of that detailed level of information saying, hey, for this particular line, at 9145, maybe call out this, but here are some additional requirements, or here's also some additional guidance on what to go do. And that's where that reference manual really comes into play. It gives flow charts, it gives additional information of how to actually, meet the requirements of AS 13100. Next slide. And finally, that's where, we were talking a second ago, that's where, the reference manual and everything, that helps give you those good practices, those best practices on how to go do things. There's process flows in there. There's also improved clarity with giving some additional information about the 9145 content. And not just, reference manual 13,145, which deals with APQP and PPAP, but also lists other different other material that helps you with the flow that you can go to go get everything from MSA information, DFMEA information, that additional level, additional information you might need to go understand, okay, actually, how do I perform this deliverable and meet those requirements? Which helps you with that improved APQP management that you need to take, that needs to take place. Um, and then also at the same time, it provides that, that robust methodology, those robust processes in order to go do things, in order to help your business meet these requirements. I cannot stress, just having those charts in there, those flow charts in there, helps you identify what organizations are responsible for it, and when does it need to be done with this part of your product life cycle. With that information, it helps you with the implementation overall and figure out, okay, what processes do I already have today that can help meet these requirements so I don't have to do a complete overhaul of everything going forward. And next slide. And with that, I'll hand off to Dan.
Everyone. So I'm Daniel McCarty, the head of quality for PCC's Fasteners and Engineered Products divisions, and I've been the deputy voting member for AESQ since 2019. So I've had quite a bit of experience with the drafting of the AS13100, and especially from a steering committee standpoint, the direction and much involvement with that. And so as I was involved with the AS13100, I was nominated to join the APQP subcommittee to represent PCC as a whole, as well as PCC structures. So go ahead, next slide. So it's going to be January 1st, right? Everybody who's received a purchase order from an aircraft engine customer or a first tier, depending on where you're at in the supply chain, and you're going to see some flow down, whether it's Sabre from Rolls-Royce or ASQR01 from Pratt Whitney, or even GE's S1000, Safran Safe, and within those requirements, you're going to note that the AS13100 is going to apply. So you have this PO, and it's after January 1st. You're asking yourself, for this product that I received a purchase order for, does APQP and PPAP package apply? So, it's a lot to be said about the advent of these requirements, and then you've incorporated the AS13100, and now you've trying to understand, how does this fit today's purchase order? And as a reminder, we're looking at after January 1st, 2023. So looking at that, first of all, you ask the question, is this a new product? Okay, so looking at the requirements, new product is going to require some advanced product quality planning, and that a PPAP is necessary to be submitted to the customer for approval. All right, so that one's easy. Where it gets a little more complicated is when you've ran this product before, it's been qualified before January 1st, 2023, and you have to determine whether or not a change has occurred. Okay, so if you're looking at the standard, the AS13100, then the reference manual, RMS 13135, there's some guidance in there of when a advanced product quality planning is required, PPAP submission is necessary, right? So if there was a design change where the customer read the drawing, that would require a PPAP submittal. If the product has experienced some changes in the process, right, especially if it's affected key characteristics or inspection plans, or the process has changed locations, those would require a submittal. Tooling changes, and even what we consider negligible process change may require a resubmittal of a PPAP or an initial submittal of PPAP. But when in doubt, reach out to your customer representative to determine if one is required, if there's some ambiguity on what you're doing or the requirements just doesn't appear to be clear to you. Okay, so once you've identified that you've had a change and you're going to have some sort of advanced quality planning and PPAP submittal, the next question is, all right, I've had one of these changes. What am I submitting, or what am I planning for? So if you go to the next slide, within the standard itself and the RMS 13145, especially on table 10, well, to make it easy for you guys, page 35, there is a table in there, and if you scroll across the top, you'll know it'll provide a change situation. But on the left-hand column here, there are different elements that apply to the PPAP package, right? So you basically figure out where you're at on the change across the top, kind of scroll down and see the different elements or categories that you would have to address and submit to the customer based on that change. Now, you know, for a new product, it's going to be everything, right? But when you start getting into source changes and things like that, not everything is required, but you have to go through the different elements, and there's a lot of footnotes to read through as well as far as applicability, but this is a good guidance. But at the end of the day, you're going to want to reach out to your customer representative to get full clarity of what's going to be submitted, and as far as the APQP PPAP package, in order for you to be approved to produce those parts based on your situation. And with that said, I will turn it over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everybody. This is Mike Feener. I work at GE Aviation as a supplier quality engineer, and in other capacities, I manage an APQP sub-team that helps to communicate the changes that are implemented by APQP, both within GE and to our supply base. I've also worked on our internal procedures to update them with regard to APQP, such as our source change process and our new product development process. I've been with GE for about 3.5 years. All in all, worked in quality and the production side of things for just a little over 10 years now. And we go to the next slide. I want to be talking to you about the PPAP file and the PPAP submission. So Dan and everyone up to this point has talked about you know, what's involved and when to apply it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what applies and what it means to submit a PPAP. So before we do that, I want to go through a couple of definitions just to kind of level the playing field before we go into the details. So what is a PPAP file? A PPAP file, it's a living document. So think of it like a PFMEA. Every time something changes, it gets updated. Same thing with the PPAP file. The PPAP file is a living file containing all of the elements to support the PPAP requirements. And the difference between a PPAP file and a PPAP submission is the PPAP submission is what you turn in. The PPAP file is everything as far as elements go that make up the PPAP requirements. The PPAP submission then is going to contain all the elements that are required to be submitted to your customer. as defined by the submission level. And we'll go through those details and just kind of wanted to clarify there is a difference between those two terms. And then we have the PPAP approval form, which is an element of the PPAP, and its function is to provide the status of the PPAP. Is it approved? Is it an interim approval? Is it rejected? And it also verifies the contents of what's submitted in the PPAP submission. And then there's a fourth definition, and this is really the only place I'll talk about this within the presentation. It's the pre-launch control plan. So I think the term control plan probably isn't new to any of us, but there's a pre-launch control plan within the APQP elements, and that really what it includes is additional process controls and features that may not be in your final production control plan. So if you're running during the development process, say if you're running a design of experiments and you're toggling and measuring features to understand the design of the hardware, that might be something you include in your pre-launch control plan, but maybe not necessarily in your final production control plan as you're trying to understand the product. And also you might go if you're utilizing design for Six Sigma in the house of quality process, you might look at certain features to understand how your design acts with an application to make sure you're meeting the customer requirements at the interface level, at the system FMEA level. And so all of those things are items that you might find in your pre-launch control plan that may not be in your final production control plan. And again, that's really the only place we'll mention that today. If you have further questions on that specific item, feel free to put them in the chat. Or again, we'd love for you to put ideas for future webinars in there as well. Anything you'd like to see. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the PPAP file. Okay, so what elements make up the PPAP file? There are 13 elements referenced on the right there that make up a PPAP file. And the file includes all of these elements, regardless of the submission level, regardless of what your customer is asking you to submit. The PPAP file is to include these elements. And again, this is real-time information. So as these elements get updated, like the PFMEA, control plans, your process maps, all those are living documents. Therefore, your PPAP file is a living document. Again, so I just want to reiterate that. That's what makes it a living document. And there could be many formats for the PPAP file. There are industry standard formats for PFMEAs and control plans and how to conduct measurement system analysis. But those industry standard formats communicate what the standard requirements are, and what those what the characteristics are for each of those elements, how to build a PFMEA, what to include in a control plan. But you could have various formats, as long as we're meeting those industry standard requirements and your customer requirements. That's really what the main goal is. And the PPAP file, it's the source of the information for your PPAP submittal. So when your customer is asking for, the first round PPAP or a resubmission of a PPAP because of a change, which Dan's process map really laid out well when to apply, APQP and PPAP if you're undergoing a change for resubmittal. You'll pull the information from your PPAP file. So as long as you keep your PPAP file a live document, including real-time information, anytime there is a change, the submittal becomes a lot easier and quicker to manage when you're submitting it to your customer. Next slide, please. Talk a little bit about what the PPAP submission or the evidence of your PPAP file is. So the submission level, what you provide your customer, is defined by your customer. There are 5 submission levels within the industry standard, AS9145, and the supplemental requirements, AS13100. I'll show you table 11 in the next slide that will here in a moment that will define what those levels are specifically. But the default, remember, is level 3. And the submission levels are dictated by the type of situation that you're facing. Is it a new product? Is it a resubmission of a PPAP where you're simply you're undergoing a process change to one feature? You might be adding a machine that affects a few features on the first article and not necessarily undergoing a design change. So your PPAP submittal, it'll vary based on the type of change, and it's really the differences in the submission levels are. It really comes out as to what you're providing to the customer. So you're not going to be asked to submit all PPAP elements in every situation. For some situations you might, but those PPAP submission levels again are defined by your customer. The default is level 3, and you can take a look at what those submission levels are on the next slide. And then, but here on this slide, one final note is that some elements allow for on-site witnessing. That is allowed within the PPAP approval process. And so this flow diagram kind of it describes the PPAP submission process. This is taken from the reference manual 13145. So you can find this in there. You're going to evaluate your PPAP file for the submission and then prepare what that submission is going to look like, within the format, what elements are going to be provided, and then submit that to the customer. Then your customer is going to tell you, are you approved? Are there items that we still need, but I could approve you to interim ship the product, and then follow up with an action to submit those final documents? Or do we have to reject a PPAP because there is an issue? We need to go back and resubmit. So when you get that green light, either with approval or interim approval, that's when you know that you're good to ship product. Next slide, please. Here's the table 11 that describes the 5 submission levels that I talked about on the previous slide. And you'll see on the left there are designators for what to submit to the customer within the submission level, what's going to be retained at the supplier and available, upon request to the customer. And then again, there's the ability to witness certain elements on site. There may be intellectual property and sensitive material that we can't share, via the PPAP submission. So in those cases, for those elements, we can witness those on site. And then there's one final submission designator that would allow for either to submit to the customer or witness on site. So the various submission levels are described in this table, and your customer will tell you which submission level, depending on the situation. Is it a new product? Is it a design change? Is it a process change? Is it a source change or a transfer? Depending on the situation, that'll dictate what submission level your customer is requiring of you. Next slide. A couple more slides here. So here's the PPAP approval form, and this is the form as it's represented in AS9145. And again, the purpose of the PPAP approval form, which is an element of the PPAP, is to communicate if the PPAP has been accepted or rejected overall. And there are, again, this document can have multiple formats as long as it includes the elements required of a PPAP approval form. And one of those elements is, the PPAP status, like I talked about previously. It'll designate whether the PPAP has been fully approved, or you have interim approval, because there are certain items that haven't been fulfilled, but the organization, your customer will allow you to ship as long as we have a follow-up action to submit that final PPAP for approval. Or, maybe there's an issue with one of the elements or some of the elements of the PPAP submittal, and we have to reject and go back and correct those items, whatever they may be. So this approval form will tell you, right, when you have the ability to ship hardware. Last slide here. And this again, this slide is going to tie in and kind of supplement some of the things that Dan said at PCC, and also some of the content that both Carl and Rob are going to share in the following slides. And that's when is resubmission required? Resubmission of a PPAP. That to define what resubmission is, it's required when a previously approved product or process undergoes a change. So we're talking about change management here with resubmission. And you can ask yourself, what is a previously approved product? That could be a product that has previously been submitted under a PPAP and been approved, or it could be existing product that's undergoing a change. Both situations apply when it comes to submitting PPAP. And again, I'll leave it up to Carl and Rob to kind of go through some additional details on change management. So thank you for your time. Now I'll hand it over to Carl Evans, go through content on demystifying APQP phases 1 through 4. Thank you.
Michael. So my name's Carl Evans. I work for Rolls-Royce. A bit of background to myself. I was one of the original writers of AS13100 and then more recently I've had the pleasure of leading the team on AS13100 APQP and PPAP in terms of the requirements and the creation of the reference manuals we've generated. I've been involved in this subject in aerospace now since 2011. I've been actively involved with the deployment of PPAP through Rolls-Royce and our external supply chain, and more recent years the APQP aspect. During my career, I've been in many a functional role in quite a few different companies, varying in different industries. The point there for me, really, that's helped me get a real good appreciation in relation to application of APQP through cross-functional teams and application of APQP and PPAP in different types of change. Transfers of works transfers, changes to manufacturing methods, introduction of new products. So that's been really helpful in terms of a lot of the work I've been involved with, but plus my peers which have been involved in this activity, these activities over the years, and the work we've been putting into the industry standards through the Aero Engine Supply Quality Group. I'm going to talk now about APQP, focus on APQP predominantly, and then at the tail end make the connection back to PPAP. What I'm not going to do is be calling up line items of requirements in standards. I'm going to talk about it in a different way. I'm going to talk about it in a way to give you a concept from start to finish of what is APQP about, and then some of the insights in terms of helping make it work in your business, and some of the good practices we've got available via the reference material we have been creating in the Aero Engine Supply Quality Groups. As a starting point, let's think about what's some of the key points that Ken said right at the beginning in connection to AS13100 and specifically about APQP. So really the first thing is it heavily relates to the standard known as AS9145 APQP. That was published in 2016. So the standard, the foundation standard for AS13100 really has been around for quite a few years now in terms of the requirements document itself. So what's the role of AS13100 in all this and requirements? Well, there are some additional requirements being called up around the subject of APQP and PPAP. Some of them have been shared with the earlier presentations, the use of submission level and related tables as an example. But when you actually look at the requirements in AS13100, the bulk of them is pointing to AS9145. In terms of actual requirements, there's very little that 13100 is asking for in terms of additions to 9145. So what's the role of 13100? And really, it's been the bulk of what's the focus has been in terms of APQP and AS13100 has been around thinking, publicising, putting in place best practices. So it's all about not only having a set of requirements, but having good practices that enable you to achieve those requirements. And the vehicles for that, there's a number of them available. There are the reference manuals, the RM documents have been mentioned a few times. There's one specific one on APQP and PPAP, but there's also a generation of other supporting reference manuals that back the supply chain in understanding best practices that are available. There is a network also of subject matter interest groups, and there is other vehicles such as community of practices, which you can find on LinkedIn as an example. So I'm going to spend time now really drawing attention to the best practices and giving you a view from start to finish of APQP. Specifically then for aerospace, so why APQP and PPAP for aerospace? It's the APQP, Advanced Product Quality Planning, is not something new. It's not something invented in aerospace. It originated in the 90s in automotive industry. You can find APQP in all sorts of sectors, wind turbine businesses. It's not something that is new in the world of industry, nor is it something that is not achievable in aerospace. What APQP is really focusing on is improving quality and reducing cost. So for our industry, aerospace, that's an important node, but also really what's important is when you've got higher levels of quality, that is synonymous with increased product safety. So there's a really important attribute that APQP brings around increased product safety. The diagram I'm showing you now on screen now, this is source information from the IAQG. It's a visual that's available for anyone to access. It's well talked about, and what it's doing is giving this concept of what is the actual total cost during a product development cycle. So on the left-hand side, it's mapping the costs against the development aspects, and then going into production, what are the costs? The first piece to point to is the purple line. And really what that's saying is in current state, there's a level of investment going on in terms of developing products and processes, and this isn't solely about a design of a product and implementing it. This is also about the manufacturing processes and the processes and supply chains that support those. But what it's mapping is that in a more traditional way, we don't put enough investment up front into the development of products and processes. But what we then do is, whilst in production, we develop those products and processes. And the result of that is costly. And the reason it's costly is because as you discover more and more around the performance of the process, the performance of the product. That can lead us to routes of escape management, the need to resolve problems, which potentially leads us down the route to requalifications and redesigns of the product and redesigns of the process. And that then provides an increased cost through the life of the product as we produce it. But also there's a significant amount of disruption, what happens within the business as a consequence of that. If we take a different view and follow the green line, and what this is now talking about is application of APQP and PPAP. And the first thing I draw your attention to is on the left-hand side is it is mapping an increased cost at the front end of the process. And it's about because one of the key things about APQP is there is a level of upfront investment. And the reason there's that upfront investment taking place because it proactively focuses cross-functional teams on risk identification and mitigations. It's all about front end of the process, about capturing what the requirements are, applying good techniques such as DFX, understanding the risks in the product and the manufacturing processes and supply chains through FMEA. So what it does is it's promoting early on in the development cycle the use of robust, proven techniques to uncover what risks are there and put mitigations in place. And it does that through a cross-functional team outlook. The result of that, as you follow the green line over, is that at a faster rate you gain a maturity in terms of the product in its early life and early production of the product. It flatlines in terms of those costs. And the reason that's taking place is the investment upfront, identifying what is expected, the requirements, making sure we can produce the product, identifying risks through proactive actions through cross-functional teams. The outcome of that is a more rapid pace over the life of the product in terms of the maturity of the product itself and the manufacturability of it. The final piece of it is it provides a really solid foundation for ongoing change management. And when I say ongoing change management, the design of the product falls into that as well as the actual process itself. So ongoing change management of the manufacturing process and things like moving facilities, works transfers. It gives a really strong foundation for any change going forwards. So APQP in aerospace offers considerable amount of benefits in terms of the development cycle of products and processes. So now I think about what is in terms of APQP, opposed to going through line items of the requirements in the standards. I want to talk about now the whole concept of going from start to finish of APQP and therefore what the requirements are looking to achieve, and then give you practices that will help you on that journey. So let's view APQP in our industry as a flight, and we're going to talk about the flight path we're going. And when I say a flight path, the reason I make the relationship to that with APQP is, and at the moment the illustration you see on screen is within standard. What it does is it represents against time what's expected to have been achieved. Certain deliverables at certain points going left to right in a development cycle. So like a flight, we need a departure point and we need an arrival point. And that's what we're going to look at now when we talk about the application of APQP throughout the development cycle. So to keep this really simple and focus on what APQP is about when managing it through this flight path, I'm just going to pull out some key pieces of information. And these are, you can find these within the reference material, the RM13145, to back this and give you more information about how to achieve these. So the very first one is, if we're on a flight path, we need to get ourselves off the ground. So the starting point for APQP is what's called the planning deliverables. That's the front end of the process. It's all about achieving a good understanding of what is expected, what are we going to change, and therefore what's the planning doing that. So see, the front end of the process is all about getting us off the ground in terms of the activities and work that needs to take place. So when we're off the ground, we're in flight. The next piece is what's called APQP and PPAP elements. So opposed to the planning deliverables, which are all about focusing us on getting off the ground and having to plan what is required well, the PPAP elements are all about the detail in terms of design, development, and validation activities. So these are the specifics that we do on the journey, on our flight. And really, they centre on two things. They centre on the phases of product design development and process design and development, and then eventually the validation phase, And they also centre on the plan that has been used, and the plan that has been used by the team, by the project, in executing what is expected in terms of APQP. So a simple way of sort of seeing this is, when we talk about a project plan in APQP, the currency you should be looking for is the elements. So have we got the elements planned for within the project plan? And therefore that is the specifics of what we have to do on our journey. The final piece to account for on our flight is what's known as the APQP and PPAP events. If we're departing from one destination point and arriving at another destination point, we want to have some in-flight checks as we progress, and that's really the role of what's known as the APQP and PPAP events. So it's really important at this point is that if you're holding in mind three planned deliverables, APQP and PPAP elements, and then APQP and PPAP events. And these three pieces really help you achieve what is being asked at the detail level of the requirements within the industry standards. So let's take a little bit further. So if we're talking about these three areas of points of focus during a flight, what about the detail within them? So when you look at the reference material and these align to what the standards are saying, you will find that it accounts for 8 deliverables. So at the front end of the journey, there's 8 deliverables potentially that need to be focused on to get us off the ground. When we're working through the journey, we've got these checkpoints, which are events, and there's 12 of those. And then finally, when we're off the ground and we are designing, developing and validating problem processes, there are 27 elements. So those are pretty key things to think about. Your reaction could be, does that mean then we have to account for 8 times 12 times 27? That feels like lots and lots of things. There's 2 points I'll draw on that. So, and to as a myth buster. Number one, think about APQPs going left to right on a cycle. You know, that left to right on a major program could be a number of years. It could be in a more short view in terms of managing change, say on a manufacturing process. It could be a far smaller window. But the focus is at points as you move across, you have a lens on some of these. So what it means is at any point in time, number one is all of these are not going to be the focal point. So the number is reduced. The second thing is, and this has been drawn up a number of times now, is these are actually configurable. and they're configurable based on various change situations. So another way of looking at it is the 8, the 12, and 27 can sit on a menu, and the menu is what drives what should be, which of these should be accounted for. And the way we express that is through different types of change situations. So in other words, a change situation, an example would be a brand new product design, or another change situation could be a transfer from one facility to another facility. They're all examples of change situations. What's really important to remember about APQP, and in terms of what the standards are asking for is, and the guidance that supports it, is that for these 3 entities, deliverables, events, and elements, there is a selection ability, and that is based on change situations. So let's help you a bit further in that thought. So in terms of change situations and these menus, on the right-hand side, this is an example of one of the APQP and PPAP application matrices, which you will find in the RM 13145, the gold book image you see on screen now. How does it work? Well, you start with, what is the change situation I'm dealing with? Is it to do with a product design? Is it a new design? Is it a change? Is it a transfer, work transfer, moving from one facility, facility A to facility B? Is it a change in the manufacturing method? Is it a new manufacturing method? Is it a change to the manufacturing method? And what these tables help you, or give you the indication of, is what to consider. In this context, the example shown, the starting point is the product design. So is it a new design? Is it going to be a change to the design? If there is, then that picks up on the first set of columns. If it's not, the next question is it a transfer? Is it a works transfer? And if it is, therefore there's an indicator and relationship with the related information on the matrices. And then finally, if it's not a new design or a change to the product design, and if it's not a transfer, then it must be a process change, a change to the manufacturing method, as an example. And you'll see on the tables that there's some variances there to give some understanding about the difference applying APQP to a new process versus a small change in the process, or a negligible change, or changes to specific tooling and stuff. So that's how these work. We start, APQP should be viewed as a flight path. That flight path takes account of 3 key things through the whole journey: the deliverables, the events, and the elements. And that's supported, the configuration, the detail around those are supported around these application matrices, which are based on the type of change you're dealing with. So let's take a little bit more of a look at this journey as we fly through. So we're starting here with the planning phase. Top left-hand corner gives you the indication of the flight path and the checks on way, and where the starting point really is something called kickoff, moving to PDR, the preliminary concept. That's our starting point for the flight to get us off the ground. What are we focusing on when we're talking about getting off the ground? That again can be simplified. That again to 44 key areas. There are some key inputs to account for. Based on those inputs, we want to capture requirements, and concurrently with that, we want to have a preliminary concept. And when I say preliminary concept, this could be of the product, but also the process, the manufacturing process, the supply chain. So what we're gaining is a view of what is required, plus what do we believe the changes, or we believe what we're trying to achieve in terms of a concept. The final piece is a plan being created off the back of those. And that then becomes the output of the planning phase. And really what I want you to think about with the planning phase is any of the change situations I've described so far will benefit from good planning. As big, as complex as they are, or as simple as they are, those basic concepts of planning, of the planning phase, will benefit any type of change. Levels in the detail, and this is what you see on screen. We're not going to go through each one of these in detail, but just keep talking about the overall concept and giving you the feel of this flight we're on. The things to point to is when we talk about a set of inputs, the standards call up the ones you see on screen. The question really is, why wouldn't you want to account for what the customer needs are? Why wouldn't you want to understand what history and lessons learned you've had from changes previously? Why wouldn't you want to explore good practices through benchmarking, and so on and so on? So where the standards pointing to these inputs, they are good practices to be accounted for. Then through the actions and activities in the planning phase, we then pick up the requirements capture, the preliminary concept, and then eventually resulting in the creation of the plan itself. And when we say creation of the plan, that's the detail that is executed to design, to develop the product and the process, and then ultimately validate those. So in the area of requirements capture, the focus is on the product, but it's also about the project as well. You know, some key aspects that what are the milestones of the customer needs. They're things that should be accounted for. When we talk about the preliminary concept, we're talking about the product, but we are talking about the process as well, the manufacturing process, the supply chain. Those two come hand in hand. We have to have a concept of what we're going to make and how we're going to make it. And then the final piece, when we talk about plan piece, when we talk about the output of a plan, as in a physical description of what is going to take place when and who's accountable. But there's other important aspects that are accounted for around subjects such as statement of work. What commitments and expenditure should we be planning for? What resources should we be planning for? And these are all the makeup of what the standards are asking for. But in a simple view, this is a way of seeing how you achieve it. That's the planning phase. Now, to help the planning phase, again, back to the toolbox, the best practices we've got in the reference manual. I'm going to give you an example, of use of these now. So we've talked briefly about requirements capture. We're not going to go any further in that or the preliminary concept, but these are two key inputs to when you want to create the plan. The other key inputs is the statement of work and the preliminary sourcing plan. Preliminary sourcing plan is the view of how you're going to execute the product design and the manufacturing, the producing of that product in terms of resources and organisations who will be involved in that. They come into one big input, and it's back to the thinking of the menus now. So the starting point really is to ask, what is the change situation we're dealing with? Is it a transfer? Is it a method change? Is it a new product design? And then we utilise the matrices we've talked about to give a view on which events and elements should be accounted for. So we've now got an idea then of what we should be accounting for in the plan. There's another tool in the box of the best practices within the reference manuals, and that's something called the APQP and PPAP timing plan. And what that does is it maps against these events, and the events are used as a way of understanding the relationship with time and the elements. And what it does is give that guidance in terms of when to expect an element to start and finish. So between the matrices and this timing plan, what you get is a view of, firstly, what should I account for in terms of events and elements? And the second one is, when should I expect these to start and finish? So the final piece to create a plan would be, what are the activities that achieve those? What's the time of those and who owns it? In other words, the plan itself can then be created in whatever format is suitable to your business and asked for by your customer. And that is centered on the elements and the events that are applicable and guidance from the use of the timing plan in terms of when things should start and finish. When we talk about plan, the execution of APQP elements, what I want you to think about is that this is very much a team sport. The visuals you see now on screen is itemizing the 27 elements. What it's doing is proportioning them out into areas of phases. So you can see, for instance, the pink area is actually talking about the product design development phase, and within there's 7 elements that are focused on. When you start looking at what the detail is in these, you can then start uncovering, actually, there's quite a few different people get involved in this. APQP is not about one function. It's about a cross-functional team execution. So if I was to look at the pink area, that's orientated around design activities around the product itself. So DFX, design FMEA. That means that brings in the design engineer and validation engineers in that area. If I look in the green area, that's talking about process design development, the manufacturing method, the actual supply chain itself being developed. And again, so does that not bring manufacturing engineering into it, along with the purchasing in terms of the supply chain? And then when we look down the bottom part, which is the yellow area, which is the product and process validation, again, there's a set of elements here, and they're really centered on making parts and using data from those. To make parts, we need to have product ordered. So again, brings in purchasing. When we make physical parts within our internal facilities in the supply chain, there's operations involved. When we're examining the data that is produced, again we'll have expertise coming into that. So very much APQP is a cross-functional team effort. It's a team sport. And it involves a number of areas in the business. A really good practice is to take the APQP timing plan, the visual shown on screen now, take the list of those elements and do something simple, which is called map it against the RACI. If you're unsure what RACIs are, Google it. Just Google RACI as in RACI, and you'll find lots of information on them. Essentially what it's doing is making it really clear to the members of the team back in your businesses who's accountable for what. So who's accountable, who's responsible, and in times where who might I need to consult around the elements and inform about information. And what it does is give a really simple structure and a clarity around who owns what in regards to the team that would be managing the product and process design, development and validation activities. So let's help this a bit further now. So we've talked about the planning phase and gave you the concepts of that, and then focused on some of the tools that really help you create the plan. And there's a strong message around that, around the execution of the plan is through a cross-functional team. So let's have a look at what's going on then when we execute the plan. So top left-hand corner, we're back onto where are we on the flight. The pink area is all about going from what's known as PDR to CDR. So the product design development activities. In terms of the green area, the process design development, the flight path for that is from the PDR, but it touches a number of the PPAP events, production readiness review, first article, leading us to initial production approval. The centre and the efforts around there is cross-functional team working, and their focus is to design and develop the product. The details of this is these elements is what you see on screen now, and that's the breakdown of the set of elements. At the moment, what you'll see on screen is this is counting out 16, and if you remember what I've said, we talked about there's 27. So there's some which haven't been accounted for, which I'll cover in a moment. But the key thing around here to think about is through the planning phase, we've understood what the requirements are. We've got a concept of what we're trying to do in terms of the product and the process. We've created a plan, we formed a team, we're now executing that plan and working through all the good stuff that needs to take place to help develop and design the products and processes. At a point in time, we will be in a position to say we need now to check this out and validate this. And that's the role of the validation phase. Again, on the left-hand side, top left-hand side, you'll see the flight path. And the flight path for the validation stage starts kicking in at something called production readiness review. And again, it's coming through the first article. It's then going through the PPAP approval to ultimately, for the project, get to the point of production launch. What's going on in this space? Well, it's focused on the validation. So again, when we talk about a plan, the plan would have activities built into it about supporting the validation elements. And what's going on in that space in terms of the validation elements are, there's a list of these now being shown on screen. To give you a feel, ultimately what's going on is we're making some parts using the production process, and then we're capturing information that will help us about quality. And when I say quality, that is the performance of the process. So an example of measuring quality on a performance of a process is defects per unit measurements. But we also then capture statistical information on key product characteristics. We want to understand the capability of the process. We also want to understand that is the process meeting the design intent, which plays the role for the first article. But there's also other things in there which respond to rate. So something called initial manufacturing performance studies, which essentially is measuring the process in terms of how long it's taken to make and what the yield rate is, and rubbing that up against the original assumptions for the process. By doing that, we get a clear indication of the process's ability to meet rate demand. The quote from Deming is on screen here, a really important message to think about in terms of validation. You know, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. With data, you have knowledge. So we've picked up a layer of detail around the deliverables and talk about the planning phase. We picked up a layer of detail and talked about the elements of APQP and PPAP and how they relate to the design, development, and validation activities. The other piece in this is to talk now about events and think about what are events, these checkpoints on the flight path. Well, the way you can see events is this. Firstly, they help with timing. Timing in terms of planning your activities and when they're expected to take place. With a view of what those are, they also help with synchronization of the supply chain, teams to teams, and members of the team. So what I mean by that is, with clarity on when we should achieve certain events, the supply chain is all working towards one goal, one point in time. Then various projects, depending on the size of the projects, you could have multiple teams involved. So it's also they're helping all the teams synchronize because they're all working towards a common goal. And then if you just see the team as a set of individuals, the cross-functional team, again, those individuals are working to a common goal. Ultimately, what are we trying to do on this flight path? We're trying to get to production launch, and we're trying to do it all together. So the events help very much in terms of timing and synchronization. They also act as approval decision points. So at points in time, we need to make a decision. Do we go forwards? Have we met and done what we expected to? Or do we need to stop and fix? So that's the other aspect to think about these. They provide us an understanding of timing and synchronization, but they're also health checkpoints as we go forwards, as we go through the flight, to ensure that we're confident that we should be continuing to go forward, or do we need to stop and fix? So what's some good practices to think about in terms of the subject of events? So you will find in the reference manual, the 13145, the gold book on APQP, you'll find that for every event, there is a pass criteria. There's some clarity being put down of what you should accept, what you should be considering when you get to these different events in terms of the approval decisions. But that's not the only thing you need to think about. Behaviours are really important around events. It's really important businesses and leadership and those involved really think about promoting the transparency of the results of these. What the information they're declaring should be really taken account of and valued. So that's what I mean by transparency. Understand where we're at particular points and value that information. And also, in relation to that, we should value leadership behaviours, the right behaviours around event management. So when we understand where we are at a point in time, we should stop and fix it if it's the right thing to do, or promote the fact that we're happy to go forwards. So this behaviours are really important to think about when we talk about events and using them in businesses. The other thing, though, is to account for the events within your project management processes. So your organisation should build these as part of the framework of your project management processes. But the other thing you should do is have a review structure in place. You know, how often and how frequently those are, that's going to be dependent on the project and the makeup of your organisation. But it's really important to have some level of review structure in place around these. And then the foundation for these is using something called Rapids. Now, the purpose of Rapid, and again, if you're not familiar with what's meant by Rapids, Google rapid decision making. There's plenty of information that describes it, but very simplistically, the way I would describe Rapids is it makes it really clear who the decider is. And by having the clarity of who the decider is, then you can also make it really clear who should be providing recommendations, what should be performed, what are some of the inputs into that, and what agreements need to be taking place. Now, today isn't about going into the details what our Rapids are. It's really worth looking into these because it puts clarity around what is expected at these events and who really is the decider. And really an observation of aerospace, and it's probably not that unfamiliar for other industries, is perhaps we get very confused about who the decider is, and we have too much bureaucracy around processes around approval and involving too many people. And the reason that is, some of it, or one of the reasons I believe, is we just haven't made it clear who's recommending, who's deciding. And that's why the rapid way of thinking is a really useful thing of mapping out the individual, what is for each of these events the right rapid for your business. So I'm going to wrap up now and finish with this final point in terms of this journey. Everything I've spoken about so far has been APQP, APQP, APQP. That is quite deliberate, because if we think about maybe how our industry's been adopting APQP and PPAP, the conversations certainly we talk about in the group we work together in, is that when you talk to the external supply chain, the conversations are predominantly feel like they're around PPAP, not APQP. The real key point I want to leave you with and think about when you talk about APQP and PPAP, and the reason we've just majored on APQP is actually APQP delivers PPAP. And the reason for that is a number of things and a number of thoughts I'll leave you with. So firstly, think about APQP. It's all about the activities that have to take place. It's your sat-nav in the journey. It's giving you that guidance. APQP and the activities that take place, they're built into the plan that's executed. The plan that's executed is with many members of cross-functional team. And we've talked about there's 27 potential elements that could be in that plan. So APQP is driving the activities at the right time with the right people involved to the right level of standards. So what's the role of PPAP? Well, PPAP is just evidence. If we describe APQP as the sat nav, think of PPAP as the traffic lights. At a point in time, a certain amount of evidence is provided to somebody independent of the team that is involved with APQP. And he or she is making a judgment about how well things have been satisfied in terms of elements. What you see on screen is the listing of the numbers of the 27 elements. The light blue ones are the indicators which say these are the elements of APQP and this is where we're looking for evidence. So what we're not doing when we talk about PPAP is accounting for all these 27 elements. We're accounting for some of them. And PPAP is looking for the evidence of compliance. And that's the link between APQP and PPAP. In other words, if you focus your efforts and work PPAP APQP process, you will deliver PPAP as an outcome. If you focus on PPAP solely, then you're going to struggle to actually achieve the requirements, because if you're not investing the time in APQP and the activities that take place, you're not necessarily going to hit the standards. On that note, I'm going to pass over to Robert.
Thank you, Carl, for that great overview. Hello, everybody. My name is Rob Latour. I'm from Pratt & Whitney, one of our technical fellows there. And in my 19 years, I've been able to work in manufacturing positions, quality positions, and in engineering positions, and see kind of the cross-functional aspects of APQP that Carl just was talking about. And I've spent the last decade really focused on the deployment of APQP and PPAP at my company. So it's really great to be here with this group to talk about this. And, as Carl said, we went on this flight path through APQP cycle, and we've reached our first destination, which is entering phase 5, where we've achieved our production approvals. But as you know, APQP doesn't end because we've reached production. Our journey's not over, our program doesn't end. And we're going to be monitoring our performance to the original targets that were set out for the program. We're going to be looking at how we're performing to our customer requirements, how are we performing to our business metrics, safety, quality, delivery, cost. And based on all this performance, we're going to be doing continuous improvement. And so what I'm going to be talking about is how does APQP and PPAP support that continuous improvement, and how do we manage that change through an APQP cycle? So if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to really continue the concept of this flight path that we are on, but in the concept of managing a change. So, when you're in production, you look at your performance and you identify opportunities for improvement. These could be opportunities in actually changing the product, a new design to meet a customer need, modification to an existing design to maybe improve on a shortfall, or it may be making changes to the production processes. Carl walked through. There are supply chain transfers from one facility to another, from one supplier to another. We may be looking to insert new manufacturing technology, a brand new process that wasn't done in the past, or maybe more basic process modifications. We're changing some parameters, changing some sequencing, refurbishing tooling. All of these change situations require a cycle through the APQP process. And the reason for it, while we make changes with the intent of improvement, right? We want good things to come from these changes. That's not always the case. Sometimes a change just doesn't work, or it may not fully be implemented well. And sometimes there's unintended consequences that could be negative and hurt us in the long term while we're trying to do something good. So there's risk involved in every change. And so we need to work the APQP to identify and manage those risks to give us the best chance of success going forward. So with every change situation, when you're launching a change project, you need to first lay out the flight plan, right? You know, the P in APQP is planning. And so we need to put together that plan up front. And the way we want to walk through this is starting out with what are the applicable phases that we're going to need to look at given the change situation that we're dealing with. And you know, on these slides, I've pulled the tables from the RM reference manual and to help you navigate how to think through these changes and what you may need to do in your business to manage the change, right? So in the table, the first two columns deal with product changes, right? The two white columns there. So a new product design or a design modification. And what you see is it's stating that we're going to need to look at all four phases of APQP for that type of change. Right, with a brand new design, you know, you're going to really go through design and development. You're going to have to look at your manufacturing process, design and development, to how it fits that new design, and then ultimately go through a validation phase and get relaunched back into production with the new design. Now, when you get to a design modification, you're still going to need to go through the four phases, but this is where the concept of configuring really comes into play. Right. Carl talked about it as a menu, and we're going to pick the right things from the menu. And you can really look at it the same way here with this modification thought process. You know, I need to apply the four phases of APQP, but I'm going to apply them in a way that is scoped and configured for the specific modification that we're making. All right, we're going to focus in on what is actually changing about this design. What development needs does that modification drive? What manufacturing processes are potentially impacted by that design modification, and therefore, based on those product and process design development needs, what validation may need to take place in the modification. Now, as you move further to the right on the table, you get to those green sections, which are the non-product changes or process changes. And the first thing you'll see is not all of the phases are applicable. Right? If we're not changing the design of the product, we don't need to go through phase 2. We're going to focus in on phases 1, 3, and 4 and look at how do those need to be configured for the particular non-product change or process change that we're dealing with. Okay, so if we're transferring to a new facility, right, we're going to need to really focus on what is the scope of the manufacturing that new facility is taking on. Is it the full scope of the value stream? Is it specific process steps? And we're going to configure the design and development needs based on that type of scope. Same thing with new products, new processes, or modified processes. And we're going to, again, configure all of the phase activities to the scope of that change, and which is why you see that. You know, the bottom line is we need to start out each project with laying out what is the flight plan, what is the full phase of activities, which helps tell us what are the resource needs, what is the cross-functional team we need engaged to make this change successful, and then what does the configuration of those phases look like so that we can properly scope the timing and resource needs to execute that change successfully. Okay, so and then we can go to the next slide. Once we understand what phases are needed, we can then start laying out the waypoints, right? We can plan out the waypoints that we need to take, which is in the form of the APQP and PPAP events that Carl talked about. And just like the phases, these are going to be applicable and configured to the scope of the change that we're talking about. So again, for new product designs, we're going to be looking at really the full scope of events that may need to take place, but configure those events to what that design is. Is it a single component? Is it a system of components? We're going to scale the events to match what is changing about that new design. When you get into manufacturing changes or process changes, again, we're going to look at specific events that are applicable to that change and configure them to what we need. So if we're modifying, say, a process, going to put together some new parameters, trying to make a quality improvement, you know, we're certainly going to need to do a kickoff and understand the feasibility of, does this concept of the new parameters match what our customer requirements are? Are we going to have potential for impacting other characteristics of the product? Do we need to take that into account as we're doing our planning, which will set us up to go into our production readiness? And oop, I think you flip sides on me. There you go. Which will lay out the plan for what kind of development we need. Are we at the state where we're fully defined the process? Are we at the state where we're ready to move on into initial process studies and ultimately get into first article and production approval? Right. So again, we want to look at what events need to take place. What is the timing of those events given those phases that we're executing? And then how do we need to configure those events to match the scope and scale of the change we're making? So the larger the change, the more events and the larger, full scale and configuration of those events that you're going to need. A minor change or a smaller change, you may have less events that you need, and you can configure them down to match the scope of that particular change and focus on the risks that change is bringing, to the full value stream that you're worried about. Okay, and then we can go on to the next slide and really talk about now the detail, between the events, which is the actual activity in APQP and PPAP elements that you're going to execute. Same concept that we're going to, continue on again. We're going to look at what is the applicability of the elements that we're going to execute, and then how do we configure those elements to match the scope and scale of the change situation we're dealing with. And another table can, set up the same way, formatted the same way. The white columns are dealing with our product changes. So if you have a brand new design, the full elements are applicable, and they're going to be focused on what is that new design. And you get into design modifications, the full scale of scope of elements would be applicable, but now you're going to configure them down to the modifications you're making. Are you only impacting certain features or certain components? And you're going to focus on updating your file for those elements on those specific features. It was stated earlier that, the APQP and PPAP files are living documents. And so that's what you want to be doing as you're working through these elements. You're going to be taking the file that was put together through your first APQP cycle and working through updates to those files to match the updates necessary for this new process or new product design, whatever the change situation is. When you get into manufacturing changes, again, you're going to look at what are the manufacturing elements necessary. So you can see in the green section of the table, the first block of elements at the top of the table are blank. And those because those elements are really related to that phase 2 or design elements. And we've already decided that phase is not applicable for a non-product change. So those elements will not be updated and expect to be worked. However, as you get into the process and design and validation elements, you start to see the applicability come into play. And that's where the team needs to think about what is the configuration necessary of these elements to match the change that we are making. And it's important to think of these in terms of what is the real risk, right? The intent of what we're trying to do here is understand our risks and properly mitigate those risks as we go through this. As we're putting together these plans and we're executing the elements, there's a tendency to want to move quickly, right? We're making a change, we're trying to get the benefits of that change as quickly as possible, right? There may be a quality improvement, a cost improvement, maybe we're struggling with delivery, or maybe we have a customer complaint that we need to address as quickly as possible. So there's a tendency to really just try to get the change done and focus on only what you're dealing with in that particular improvement. And sometimes you can miss some unintended, influence that may happen when you're trying to make that change. I'm changing a parameter to fix a certain feature, and maybe another feature is influenced by that I didn't really think through ahead of time, right? So it's important to really go through these elements, and the concept is, sometimes you have to go slow to go fast, right? If we can go through these elements, do proper planning, execute them well, configured down to the scope of the change, we are going to be more effective in implementing that change, be able to implement it successfully, and once implemented, be able to see the benefits intended by that change. So, as you're going through this, you're going to be looking at, how does this change impact my process flow diagram? What process steps are impacted? Based on that impact, do I need to make any changes to my floor layout? Do I need to make any changes to my inspection plan? And then you're going to go through and update your file for your process FMEA. Looking at characteristics that are not only created but affected, and what are the potential risks given the new process, right? A new process means a new set of risks, and what mitigating actions might need to take place in order to manage the risks associated with that. As you continue on, updating your control plan, looking at your new capacity. Is there any changes to the supply chain that need to be managed? Are any of these changes going to impact your measurement systems? Or do we need to implement new measurement systems or change the measurement systems in any way, which may drive us into new studies? And then, it leads us into the validation elements, understanding what are our initial process capability studies and dimensional results to see, did the change do what we expected it to do? Are we getting the output that we expected, the capability that we expected? And based on that validation, we can go into the first article and PPAP approvals to get ultimately back to the end of our flight plan and launch back into production, with that change situation, effectively completed. Right. So, bottom line messaging in all this, first, with any change situation, we need to have a kickoff with good planning up front, right? Quality planning, APQP is about planning. So lay out the plan, look at what phases are applicable, how do we need to configure those phases. Based on that, we can set our waypoints with the APQP events, set our timing plan for the change, and configure those events to match the scope of the change, and then execute our elements. Based on the phases and change situation, we can understand what elements are applicable. We can configure those elements to match the scope of the change, execute them, and get back into production with an effective change implemented and see the benefits that we were going after. Okay. And with that, I think we are ready to go to wrap up some more poll questions and get into some question and answer.
We do have a poll question open right now. Have you read Reference Manual 13145? And we do have 51 votes, but if everyone else wants to hop on and submit your vote, you can open the Slido poll on your screen or open it on your cell phone if you scanned the QR code earlier and answer that question. So we'll just give you a few more seconds there. Right now we have 36% said yes, we have read RM13145, and 62% said no. So there's a few more votes coming in, but the percentages are relatively the same. So let's move to the next poll question, which is, are you using Reference Manual 13145 as a guide for APQP and PPAP? So we'll give you a few seconds there to go ahead and submit your votes. Looks like we have a few coming in. There's 15 votes, 17 votes. We'll give you a few more seconds there so we can get some results, and we will share these results with you afterward. We'll send out a summary email and attach the polling results so you can see those later. So there's a few more votes coming in. Right now we have, it looks like 39% said yes, they are using Reference Manual 13145 as a guide, and 61% are saying no. So let's move on to our next poll question. How would you judge your knowledge of APQP? Go ahead and answer that poll question. There's a couple of options there. So we'll give you a minute to do that. Looks like we have about 35 votes. We'll give you a few more seconds there, but the overall results right now on how would you judge your knowledge of APQP, no knowledge, 2%, 54% said I know of it, but no experience of using it. 36% said I have used it a few times, and 7% I consider myself to be an expert. So let's move on to the next poll question. How would you judge your knowledge of PPAP? So we'll give you a few more seconds there to go ahead and answer that question. Looks like we have about 37 votes. A few more votes are coming in. So how would you judge your knowledge of PPAP? 3% said no knowledge. 40% said I know of it, but no experience using it. 43% said I have used it a few times. And 14% said I consider myself to be an expert. So those are some good results there. And then our next poll question, what additional topics would you like us to cover in future webinars? So if you want to go ahead and enter your answers there. If there are other things you would like us to cover other than APQP and PPAP, we would love to hear from you so that we can take those into consideration for future webinars. And note also on the AESQ website, we've run a number of webinars in the past year and a half, and we record all of them. So those videos and presentations are on the website for free viewing and reference whenever you want to take a look at those. I know there is a human factors one out there. There's a first article inspection and several others. So there's some good results coming in there. And let's make sure I think I missed one of the questions. So let me just double check real quick. One more question here for you. How well is your business in deploying APQP? So if you want to go ahead and answer that question real quick. There's some votes coming in. So we'll just give you a few more seconds to answer that question so we can get some good results to share with you. 25 votes. So how well is your business in deploying APQP? It looks like 3% said not capable and have no plan. 16% not capable but have a plan to facilitate capability. 8% capable and have no improvement plan to increase capability. And 67% capable and have an improvement plan to increase capability. So well done there. So that is the end of our polling questions. We will provide a summary of these polls to you in a follow-up email. So thank you for participating.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Magnus Holm and I work as a supplier quality systems lead at GKN Aerospace. I've worked in both the automotive and aerospace business for several years. And my main focus has always been product development and quality assurance in various roles. And I've been part of this team since 2021.
Yes, and my name is Åke Winkvist, also working within GKN Aerospace. I've been working with APQP and PPAP for 25 years, first in the automotive and now in the aerospace industry. This is really interesting to see how we're developing this material into the aerospace.
Yeah, we will not be able to cover all the questions in this webinar, but we will come back with answers on the AESQ website later on. But we will take a few questions. So here is one question that I would like to direct to Ken. Hatcher. It's related to the relation between AS9145 and AS13100. So the question is summarized: do we need to implement AS9145 plus AS13100 plus RM13145 to be compliant?
You got to remember one thing, that's as of today, I mean, there's not a certification body to these particular standards, but in terms of, it would be good to be familiar with 9145, but if your focus is within the aerospace engine supplier group, you can just simply focus around the AS13100, and therefore you would, it's basically the way I would almost compare it to, if your QMS is AS9100, certified, you meet the ISO 9000 requirements, kind of the same thing. AS13100 kind of complements 9145. So by meeting those requirements and the call outs within there, you'd be in compliance with 9145.
Yeah, so I guess the answer is that you need to look in both AS9145 and AS13100.
Yeah.
You need to read them in parallel, so to say. Yeah. And the next question, I think I would like to reach out to Dan for that one. It's related to raw material suppliers and PPAP. So the question is, do raw material non-first tier suppliers send the PPAP to the direct customer or the primes for approval? Would you like to comment on that, Daniel? Is he with us? I guess he left.
We need to come back to that on the website, the AESQ website in that case.
Yeah, there is a table 1 in AS13100 where you can see which requirement is applicable for which type of supplier. But we will come back on that one. Then a question that came up during Carl's presentation. So I will direct that one to you, Carl. And it's related to suppliers that work both in the engine business and the aerostructure business, so to say. Is there a roadmap to have only one APQP PPAP standard suitable for both aero engine and structural parts manufacturers? Carl.
So I'm trying to understand. I suppose I don't know enough about some of the structural parts, but the way I'm reading that is structural parts are looking at 9145, and then we're saying aero engine is a plus 13100. So my take on that is
the question is, I think, will they merge someday? Yeah.
So I think the first point to redraw on, when we talk about requirements, if you remember what I was talking about, so there's a small amount of requirements 13100 is asking for on top of 9145. And one of the examples used is the use of submission levels as an example. So that's one point, is what's significant. Is there a significant difference in requirements? There actually isn't a significant difference in requirements. It's more about how you execute the practices that we're trying to promote around helping suppliers deliver that. The second piece on this is I am aware that 9145 is reviewing the standard at the moment, and I am aware from information I've seen that a lot of what 13100 is promoting is in consideration at the moment. I can't really comment anything more on that because that's really the sort of the communication that needs to come from the group leading 9145, if that's all right with everybody. I'm not trying to get out of that. I don't really want to talk on behalf of the group leading the standards. So key points for me is 13100, when we talk about APQP, is only asking for a few more requirements. That's point number one. It's the bulk of everything is about the practices to enable you to achieve those requirements. And that we demonstrated quite a lot of those practices today, and we intend to do more in the future. In terms of 9145, I am aware that requirements accounted for within 13100 are in review and debate about adding those to 91, about adding those. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. So we have sort of questions, both very detailed questions related to maybe the application of certain tools, but we will come back with answers that on the website. But here is one question that I would like to, and I think that will be the final question that I would like to direct to Robert, just so I can understand it. It's related to the deliverables in phase 5. Are they followed as long as the production of the part continues, is the question.
Yep, yeah, I saw that in the chat. AS9145 defines phase 5 as ongoing production, use, and post-service delivery. So just meeting the targets that were set out at the beginning of the program doesn't end phase 5. It continues on through use and post-delivery service. And the purpose is to continually look for opportunities to improve customer satisfaction, looking for cost reduction, looking for delivery improvement, variation reductions, whatever may be needed, constantly monitoring that, as well as to capture lessons learned to build into the next program cycle that you go through. So phase 5 is really open until end of product life cycle for the program to continually monitor and look for opportunities for improvement, both within that program as well as to feed back into the next APQP cycle for the next program.
Yeah, thank you. Just one final sort of comment that I mean, there are several subject matter interest groups within AESQ. So if you have very detailed questions around MSA or PFMEA, the best thing is really to approach that group for that particular tool, because they are the experts on that. So with that, I will hand over to Åke for some closing comments.
Yes, thank you.
Next slide, maybe. I don't know if there is a last slide or not, but go on, Åke.
Yes, I think that's all for today's webinar. And on the AESQ website, there will be frequently asked questions that will be available, and we will update them in the next couple of weeks. There's also email address where you can send questions. So please do that. I think that was the end of today's webinar. And thank you all for participating. Thank you and goodbye.
Bye.